Hey, it's Chris, Leisure Games. The most anticipated game for me coming to crowdfunding has just been announced the launch date. Why am I excited about ARCs? What makes me so excited? And now, why did that all of a sudden shoot up not only at the top of the May list, but perhaps of all 2022? Let's talk. So if this game is thought to be so good, if this game is thought to be one of the best games that came out in the last couple of years, if this game is thought to be awesome, why is this game not on more people's shelves? For a matter of fact, it's the same reason why this one isn't on more people's shelves, or why it has such a higher turnover on people's shelves in the first place. It goes back to what I said when both the campaigns launched. This is not a game for everybody. These are not games for everybody. And the number one reason for that is it comes down to one single word. It is a very nuanced and very deep word, but that word is accessibility. Accessibility. Which then spawns into overhead, which then leads to rules, which then leads to asymmetry, which then leads to just you need a lot of people knowing what they're doing at all times across the board. But not only do you have to explain it to them, you need to know how yours differs and how theirs differs and how theirs differs, and then knowing what they can do and knowing how they can manipulate. And there's just a lot. And then you make it more of a war game with sheep's clothing because, I mean, it's cool art, but it's a war game, essentially. Not everyone is going to grind those gears quite the same way. Now, when we talk about this one again, the sprawlingness, the massive size, the expanse that has tried to cover all in one box has also been off-putting. I mean, again, it is a meta game in the hotness world that we live in. And, you know, it's more akin to getting out a new game each time if you're like me, trying to get stuff played, trying to figure out whether or not I like it, whether or not to keep it, let alone getting multiple plays over a short period of time. Because that's essentially what both of these games also have in common, is that's what you need to be able to do to manipulate and to keep them in your collection, to keep them in your rotation. So why am I so excited about ARCs? Because it takes everything that makes that one so great, and it takes everything that that one brings, only it distills it down to a more streamlined 3-game-ish, hour to an hour and a half session-ish scenario. Even playable over one whole time span if you want. And the whole design behind it essentially is to, going back to that one word I mentioned earlier, accessibility, is to make it more accessible to more people. Now, well, how do you do that then, though, right? That's the big question. How do you take a game like that and give more people opportunities to play it without losing the distinct dynamic nature of these leader games in the first place? Because, I mean, that is the asymmetric dynamic of what they're known for, right? Whether it's Vast, Root, Oath, any of those, that is what is associated with them in a great way. But it isn't for everyone. So if you're trying to make that for everyone, well, how do you do that? Well, let's pull up just some of the points, because if you're not watching closely, if you haven't been following, it has a Board Game Geek page. And Cole Worley, has been posting designer diaries on there, and there are 5 at the time of me filming this, and it gives such good insight into why it elicits such excitement out of me already. And, oh yeah, I kind of buried the lead here, right? It's launching on May 24th. And it's going up against some stiff competition, but let me tell you right now, as they say in AEW, I'm all in, baby. So we'll just start at the beginning. If you're not familiar with ARCs, if you are turning into my channel and you're saying, Chris, why are you hyping a game that I've never heard of? Well, let me tell you again, right, why we're talking about it, why you should be interested in what this game is about. Going straight from the designer's mouth himself. Micro campaign game, 1 to 3 sessions to finish. You can play abridged campaigns that even take only 2 or 1 session. 1 to 2 hours, depending on player experience. And you can do all 3 acts in a single session. And I mean, it's Oath in space, if you're familiar with Oath at all in that sense. You can save your progress, but you start out as these small spacefaring societies and you're building into a larger, massive metropolis of an empire. Do you enjoy choices, moral, ethical choices that are going to influence not only how your faction develops, but the course and the fate potentially of the universe? That is what they're giving you right here. Now, as they compare it, as I already did, root is a snapshot of different asymmetric positions, as they say. This is the development, the ongoing play of making those asymmetric sessions or factions as you are making your way through each of these sessions. So you get to see, you get to decide how that cat, how that eerie, how whatever faction is left at the end is ultimately forged in the heat of this campaign. Now, don't be afraid. If you are one of those people who's already turned off and saying, I don't need another campaign game, even if it's only a 3-session campaign, well, they already addressed that robust single session mode, which there will be a part of. So do not fear. And it differs. I mean, because we're not talking about Oath 2.0. We're not talking about, as I, sort of facetiously said earlier, Oath in space. No, this is distinctly different. It has restrictions, it has differences that you need to be aware of that you may or may not like depending on how you feel about the original Oath product in the first place. It doesn't have discrete notions of beginnings, middles, and endings, right? Arc has no such restrictions. Oath is smooth. Arc is jagged in how it's jumping, presenting, acting. Now, here is the mixed bag as well. Oath, jump in, jump out. Arcs, you will need to start and finish it together, which is more in line with the legacy campaign games you may be more familiar with. Now, again, you don't need to. No one says you need to play all, 15 pandemic legacy games from season 1 or season 2 together, but it's a more cohesive narrative if you do. So that's just the general overview. What do you need to know about more of the specifics? And this leads me to designer diary number 2. And I'm just going to go briefly into this one and give more heavy influence on the other ones, because this one just has one very, very solid point that I think is, very important. When you are playing a game, when you are invested in a game situation and you are immersed in it, as he says, whether that is a game, whether that is a story, whether that is a show, all of a sudden something happens to break the immersion, and it totally can flip the script on how you feel about the situation, the game, the experience. Like, it's essentially jumping the shark, if you will, to excuse or use that cliche phrase. And he makes it very clear here, as the example being a card in Magic the Gathering that you have never seen before, that is complicated, that is introduced all of a sudden that no one is familiar with, and then it sort of stalls things out. It makes things less exciting. The dynamic nature that was there previously has all of a sudden tapered to a stuttering halt, and you kind of lose what you were going with in the first place. So what they're doing here is they are eliminating that, but also not trying to make it too complex, but giving you those moments as well that come in that dynamic sense. So he says, how do you balance that with avoiding, but also introducing some of the riskier and more interesting structures, to keep the game from being stale, or from keeping the game being the same, or keeping it shaken up, if you will, from turn to turn, round to round, session to session. And that structure, that dynamic between that structure, that tension between players, how do you mitigate that? How do you keep people engaged from a strategic, long-term view while keeping them tactically involved at the same time? And this is where the third design diary sort of ties in the actual mechanics that we're going to see in the form of, again, stay with me, trick taking, because of the nature of them, because of the potential auction mechanic, as opposed to traditional games where you think of them, as he describes, as multiplayer solitaire, as is the colloquialism that's often used or thrown around. When you think of a game like, for say, Al Grande, like they mention, the auction, the mechanic that this manipulates and really brought to light when it came around is, if you want that card, if you want that particular action to be able to do, you're going to have to fight for it. You're going to have to maneuver for it. You're going to have to offer something of more value in order to get the benefit of something slightly better for you. Not necessarily better overall because you don't know what other people are doing, but for you, you may need to give up more to gain more. And now incorporating that, not with just auction, but in trick taking, which share similar overlaps in the sense that high risk, high reward. I'm going to play something that's going to give me potential benefit, but I don't know what you have, so we'll see how it goes. I mean, obviously, then if you're doing tricks, right? High cards win. High cards trump. High cards are the thing you want. So how do you balance that out? Well, obviously, then you change the interactions or the strengths and the weaknesses. High cards are high cards, but low cards will give you other things to consider about why you may want them in the first place, like just having more available actions or resources to go along with them apart from the low number. Then he goes in to describe what can you do with the actual trick taking mechanics. You can follow suit. If you have a higher card than the suit that was already played to be led with, maybe you get more actions. If you have a card of a different suit, maybe you only get to choose one of the actions on there if you're choosing to do that as sort of a pivot in direction of the hand or the trick that's being played. Or if you just play a face down card of your own choosing, you can get a separate action that you may not have access to. But the difference in this is that you do not have to follow suit. But if you do or do not, it's going to, again, change the tension of when you choose to do things, or if you're going to have access to doing the things you need to do when you need to do them. Including things like battling, where it's going to give you more control over the tempo at which these things occur and how they occur to you. Playing off of that, the next design diary talks essentially about those tempos I was just mentioning and relates it to not only how many actions you may be able to play on a turn, where you could get anywhere from 5 to 15 actions per turn, in contrast to the very static amount of actions potentially that you have access to in Oath, or even more particularly Root. So essentially then, how do you change that? How do you give a dynamic while still changing the pace of the game, essentially? And how he says it here is he expands the map so that if someone is advancing towards you, if someone is making dynamic moves against you, you have more time to react. Your units, instead of just being knocked out in one single hit like in Root, they can take a hit before being knocked out. So it gives you a chance to sustain yourself without a coup de grace, as he mentions, that can be otherwise devastating, especially in the war games space in general, where there is no guardrail to prevent you from taking bad moves, or no guardrail to keep you from making a larger mistake that could ultimately lead to your victory or defeat very, very early on. The second design element, the second time element, is how do you utilize some of those pieces that you are given? Is there actually a time effect? And if you get things like victory points, what do those victory points represent? And how do your objectives get achieved even in the interludes? Because, as you see with, say, stories that have time skips. Anime, for example, does that all the time, where all of a sudden your protagonists are 18 and then they're 25, or 18 and then 22. They skip a couple years, and so there is a dynamic change in who they are, what they are, how strong they are, those sort of things. And that's essentially what they're going for here in between the campaign sessions, to make the interludes of how you spend that time, even between, but not only in the game, dynamically different in terms of spending some resources, acquiring things, going for objectives, or whatever else. And that leads directly into the latest design diary, which really dives into more of the asymmetry and why this game is unlike, as I mentioned at the beginning, Root, in the sense that not only are you given the asymmetry, but you are allowed to develop your own asymmetry as you are going. And well, how do you do that? Well, the basic core of it essentially is everyone starts off with a very similar setup, very similar terminology that you are all going to be able to understand to eliminate some of that immense overhead that I mentioned with the two behind me. And then you slowly add just a few, not layers upon layers upon layers. But what you allow people to do is basically have a set of 6 that are going to be interchangeable, interrelatable, and replaceable as you go, with an opportunity cost situation that will, again, allow you to customize, but also allow you to drastically have a different set of technologies resources, and ships, whatever else, than your opponent. Calling that sort of a flexible tech rather than a set defined skill tree or tech tree that many of these games have, especially on the video game side of things, where you unlock one, it unlocks a couple, then you choose one, and then it unlocks a couple more, and then you have to have this one and this one to unlock this one. Well, you can do some of that, but it's going to cost you maybe one of the other things that you've already had, not just layer upon layer. And if you want to get rid of something more essential, well, again, you can do that, but it's going to cost you. It's going to come at a very, very expensive price. And the question always is going to be, is that price worth it over the short term, but also over the long term? Because you can not only play for the short term 1 or 2 sessions, but you can also build up and go for the long shot, as they say, where if you want to accumulate and specifically go after one niche of the corner of this development technology, you can do so. And it may cost you the first or second games, but if you are willing to, excuse the phrase, or the tie back into trick taking, if you are familiar with hearts at all, if you want to try and shoot the moon in the third phase, the third campaign session, you can go for it. But go big or go home, right? And that dynamic is super impressive to me, and that's why I'm so excited. And it goes into much more detail than I can ever do. It's worded in a way that makes you excited in these design diaries. So if you have any interest at all in anything that I've said and doing a poor man's summary of what ARC is about so far based on what we know, you need to go out to the Board Game Geek forums and check this out. So in a nutshell, there you go. A way longer nutshell than I was planning on. But when something like this is given the opportunity to present itself and for me to be able to talk about it, this is the reason I am in this hobby. This is the reason I'm making these videos, because this is what excites me. The innovation, the dynamic intervention and interaction between players, between designers and players, getting some insight into what is going on behind the scenes. Because it's one thing to see it, it's another to hear someone else talk about their passion and to be able to hopefully relate to it and experience it yourself in the near future. So there you go. My thoughts on ARCs. Let me know what you think. Let me know, are you interested in something like this or not? Again, Leader Games putting out great products. The question is always just, is it for you? So that's the thing you got to answer for yourself. Tune in though. I'll be covering it plenty when it launches on May 24th. If you like that, I have a Patreon. Stay classy. Hit the thumb button. I'll see you around. That's all I got. No end ramble. We're good today.